Good evening, everyone. My name is Lana Burgess, and I'm the faculty curator at the McKissick Museum at the University of South Carolina. I was also the curator in charge at the museum for our current exhibition, which is online, called A Woman's Right, and it looks at the history of women at the University of South Carolina. This iteration looks at 1945 to the present. I would like to thank you for joining us this evening and let you know that tonight's program is sponsored by the museum and the College of Arts and Sciences, who has provided co-curricular grant funding in support of programs and classes for the University of South Carolina's first ever Justice themed semester. I want to also recognize Hannah McGraw and I call her by her nickname Bingo, Jennifer Gunter, who curated the exhibition for us. Dr. Gunter is on staff at the university, and Hannah McGraw is an undergraduate and about to graduate this semester. So congrats and thank you again, Hannah. And I also need to recognize Kate Crosby, who is the former curator of exhibitions at the McKissick Museum. It took a lot of time and effort, including all of the staff's help, and we hope that you will check out the McKissick Museum website and take a look at our online offering. We also hope to be joining you live again in the spring. But in the meantime, we will continue to offer programs such as this online. And I want to let you know for this particular program, we will be taking questions after the lecture. So please, as you're thinking of your questions, go ahead and pose them in the Q&A box so we'll have them ready to go. And now I would like to introduce our speaker, and I can't tell you, I'm beyond excited. I heard this person speak back over the summer, and I immediately thought, I've got to figure out how to get her to be a part of our programs because we've been wanting to do a program related to Title IX. So joining us this evening is Erin Buzuvis, and she joined the faculty at Western New England University's School of Law in 2006, where she also serves as the director of the Center for Gender and Sexuality Studies. She's had a busy 2020, and while the rest of us are suffering from COVID, she's been suffering from being appointed, or probably not suffering, but thrilled with the appointment of being Associate Dean for Academic Affairs at the Western New England School of Law earlier this year. Dean Buzuvis holds a Bachelor of Science degree in biochemistry from the University of New Hampshire, and she graduated magna cum laude with her Juris Doctorate from Cornell University, where she was inducted into the Order of the Coif Honor Society and served as managing editor of the Cornell Law Review. Dr. Buzuvis researches and writes about gender and discrimination in education and athletics, including such topics as Title IX's application to campus disciplinary proceedings for sexual assault, Title IX and college athletics reform, LGBTQ inclusion in high school and college athletics, and retaliation and related discrimination against female college coaches. She has been quoted in stories about Title IX in such media outlets as the New York Times, NPR, Sports Illustrated, Inside Higher Ed, and many other national and local publications and broadcasts. Dean Buzuvis teaches courses at the law school on administrative law, employment discrimination, Title IX, torts, property, and has co-directed the school's comparative gender law course in Israel. In addition, she has taught a course on LGBTQ policy issues at the Smith College for Social Work. And in 2017, she co-taught a course on gender, human rights, and sport at Utrecht University in the Netherlands on a grant from the Fulbright Specialist Program. Prior to becoming a faculty member, Dean Buzuvis was an associate attorney at Goodwin Procter LLP in Boston, and she also clerked for Judge Thomas L. Umbro of the U.S. Court of Appeal for the Third Circuit. So many accolades. If you Google her name, you will see that she is being quoted constantly. She is out there working really hard and fighting for Title IX, and it is my great pleasure and delight to have Erin talk to us this evening about Title IX and its impact on women's athletics. Erin?
Lana, thank you so much, and thanks to the museum, and thank you to the University of South Carolina for giving me this opportunity to talk about my favorite subject, which is Title IX and its application to athletics. As a law professor, I like Title IX because it's probably the most famous law there is, right? People have always heard of Title IX, and even if you only pay attention to women's sports once in a while, there always seems to be a rhythm to Title IX's rise in media popularity. So, for example, every time the U.S. national women's soccer team plays in the World Cup, we get a lot of headlines like these, crediting Title IX for the success of that team. And similarly, every 4 years, every 2 years, I should say, whenever there's either a winter or a summer Olympics, when the U.S. Female athletes do well, there's always a resurgence in Title IX awareness at those moments as well, right? So raises a couple questions. What is Title IX? What is specifically its role and its impact? Let me back up. Its role and its impact on women's athletics, and does it really deserve all of the credit that it receives on a regular basis for showcasing American female athletes on the international stage? Well, Title IX is part of a broader law that was passed in 1972 that had to do with a lot of different issues in education, both higher education and K through 12. And it was a tiny provision in a big law that basically says just a few words that are projected here. No person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, denied the benefits of, or be subject to discrimination under any educational program or activity that receives federal financial assistance. So most of our colleges and universities receive federal financial assistance in some way. All of our public K through 12 institutions do. And so Title IX had an immediate impact on a large swath of our education system at all levels. But what was the purpose of Title IX? How did this work its way into the law? What many people who've heard of Title IX through the context of athletics, or maybe you've heard of Title IX for the impact that it's having in addressing sexual misconduct on college campuses, what people who have a contemporary awareness of Title IX are often surprised to learn is that the challenges that Title IX was designed to address had to do with discrimination in admissions to undergraduate and particularly graduate programs. Before Title IX was passed in 1972, it was common for colleges and universities to say to female applicants, we already have our 20% women. We already have our little quota of women, and we're not going to add more women to our class. Law schools, medical schools, veterinary schools, business schools. And why did they do this? It's because they believed that women were actually in it for the quote MRS degree, right? That women were going to college and going to graduate school, not to get an education that they were going to use to change the world, but that they were there to find a husband. And that being the case, they didn't want to give away too many of those precious seats to people who weren't really serious about their education. And so there were activists who were outraged by the state of affairs, including this woman here on the right, Bernice Bunny Sandler, who as a young activist in an organization called the Women's Equity Action League, started to become politically aware and to challenge her own exclusion from being considered for faculty jobs in higher education because of these same sentiments and biases, not taking female academics seriously, just like they weren't taking female graduate students seriously. And so through her organization, she started to lobby members of Congress, and she got enough of them on her side that they managed to add Title IX to this bill that was working its way through Congress. And part of the strategy of getting Title IX passed was to be pretty low key about it because there were a lot of other controversial things in this bill. And people thought if nobody's paying that much attention to these 37 words about gender equity that we've slipped in there, there's going to be much more likely or much less likely that people are going to try to change them or water them down or get them out of the bill entirely. And that strategy worked. And that low key nature of Title IX is apparent even in its passage. So this is the page of the New York Times, page A17 of the New York Times on the day after Title IX was passed. You certainly wouldn't know that something as watershed as Title IX's passage had just occurred. First of all, by the placement of the article about the education law as on the whole being put on page 17. But where do you suppose the first mention of Title IX shows up? It's not until several columns in when they finally get to even mentioning that this bill had anything to do with gender. And that's because there were provisions that had to do with racial desegregation. There were provisions that had to do with funding for Native American education. There were other more high-profile provisions of this bill. So Title IX slipped its way in. But very soon after, people started to think about, wait a second, a lot of our athletic programs are in education, and Title IX is now saying that education programs have to commit to gender equity and can't discriminate on the basis of sex. So what is Title IX going to mean for sports? So this question is raised, and there was very early opposition to Title IX's application to college athletics by heavy hitters such as the NCAA. The NCAA opposed both in an advocacy strategy aimed at lobbying Congress to try to get Congress to change aspects of Title IX to exempt sport, or at least to exempt their favorite sport, football, which did not work. And the NCAA also tried to battle in the court system to try to get courts to interpret Title IX in a way that that would not apply to college athletic programs. That effort was successful in the courts, but was ultimately overturned by an amendment that Congress added to the law in the 80s. So Title IX now confirmed its application. Now its application to athletics is confirmed. But that's just the first hurdle. The next hurdle is figuring out, what does it mean to say that athletic programs can't discriminate on the basis of sex? After all, we live in a world where athletic programs are segregated by sex. We have men's athletic programs and women's athletic programs, boys sports and girls sports. And one definition of discrimination is using somebody's sex to define the opportunity that they receive or that they're not allowed to receive. And so one question right off the bat is, can you have sex segregated programs in a world where sex discrimination is prohibited? And so the Department of Education, actually its predecessor agency, Health, Education, and Welfare, its Office for Civil Rights, was tasked with figuring this out and coming up with regulations that would define in more detail what non-discrimination in athletics would look like. And the first serious question they had to tackle was this idea of, can we still allow sex segregated programs, sex segregated sports to exist? Or does non-discrimination mean we have to have an open to all model where we just say there's one team and you try out for it and you make the team without anyone considering your sex, then the best athlete will make the team. And there was a lot of debate on both sides of this. Even feminists were divided about whether an open to all model compared to some kind of separate but equal model would be preferred. Some feminists believe that a separate but equal model would not live up to its name, as often separate but equal doesn't, and in other contexts has been struck down for its inability to actually create equality. That it would leave in place stereotypes and biases and always render female athletes in women's sports inferior. But on the other hand, there were arguments that unless there were separate and protected athletic opportunities for women, it would be really difficult to move past the current state of things, which was women's low level of participation, and frankly, women's low level of athleticism, because they hadn't had opportunities in sufficient numbers up to that point. And so being able to protect and preserve opportunities for women was thought to be something of an antidote to this history of discrimination, kind of like an affirmative action step that would say, while we strive towards equality, we're going to separate these opportunities for women and protect them as such. But separate has to mean equal, says the Department of Education. There are some requirements around that equality. One is that this is actually, I'm sorry, this slide is about the separation part, allowing for separate athletic programs to exist. The only exception, there are some narrow exceptions when a school would have to let somebody try out for a team that's designated for the other sex if there's not a team already in that sex, and the sport in question is not a contact sport. So Title IX would say, for example, if you have a golf team, you can't say it's just your men's golf team, you have to let women try out. But otherwise, they allow this separate but equal model to flourish. Now, back to what I was saying about the equal side of separate but equal. There are a couple of different ways we measure the equality part. And part of it has to do with the number of opportunities that are available to members of each sex. And so schools are given a little bit of flexibility, a little bit of a choice here. But there's one test that uses statistics and is easy to measure and easy to assess. And it says that you've achieved compliance with this aspect of Title IX if the percentage of athletic opportunities that you make available to women matches their percentage in the population. So, for example, maybe people know what the gender breakdown is for the undergraduate student population at the University of South Carolina. Anyone know? Anyone want to guess? It's about 53.5% female. So if you were going to comply with this first prong about proportionality, you would expect 53.5% of the athletic opportunities also to be designated for women. And University of South Carolina, just because I'm using you as an example to explain this test, comes close. 50.6% of the athletic programs, athletic opportunities are afforded to women, compared to 53.5% of the undergraduate population being female. So it's a close call. Courts have considered how close those numbers have to be in order to constitute compliance with this prong. And it turns out it gets a little more complex there. First thing you have to do is convert it to an actual number. How many more opportunities would you have to add in order to close the gap between those 2 percentage points? And I did the math for USC, and it turns out that there's about 42 more athletic opportunities that you would have to add to come right up into exact proportionality. And because that number is just about the size of a new team, it's possible that a court could say that that is a compliance challenge and that that's something that is not quite close enough as things stand right now. But that's not the only way to demonstrate compliance. Schools can also show a history and continuous practice of expanding opportunities for the underrepresented sex, in this case women. And schools are rarely in compliance with prong 2, because if they really have been, ever since these regs were promulgated in 1975, continuously adding opportunities for women, they would have met proportionality by now. So this test ends up not getting too much play. The third test is where most schools strive for compliance, because with increasing number of female undergraduate students, that proportionality prong is challenging for many schools of your size and type anyway. So they ask whether women's athletic interests and abilities are fully satisfied. Are there enough women at your college or university who are disappointed with the absence of some additional athletic opportunity? And if you could point to sufficiently high levels of interest within the student body, you would be able to make a case that prong 3 is not met. But regulators and courts wisely also look for evidence of unmet interest outside the scope of your student body, because it's a self-fulfilling prophecy to say that women aren't interested in, say, the sport of golf if there's not a women's golf team at your college. Those women who were interested in golf went somewhere else, right? So courts and regulators say we also look to regional trends. We look to what sports are popular among the schools that you compete against. And we actually ask the hypothetical question: if you added a new sport for women, and you funded it the same way you fund your other varsity sports, and you recruit for it with the same zeal that you recruit for your other sports, would you be able to fill a team? And if the answer is yes, you probably have more work to do to comply with the third prong. So it ends up getting a little bit complex here when we're talking about how to measure equality in terms of the number of opportunities you give to members of each sex. But Title IX also looks at the quality of those opportunities and demands gender equity on that plane as well. And so part of it has to do with the scholarship dollars that are awarded to participants in each sex, that those awards of athletic financial aid have to be proportionate to the percentage of athletes of each sex. And then we look at other resources that go into sport, resources that go towards things like everything from equipment and uniforms, facilities, how often you get to compete, where and how often you get to practice, what kind of support goes into your travel. Are you taking a van that you have to drive yourself, or are you getting a chartered plane? Do you get put up in a fancy hotel or something less so? How about the coaches that they hire to coach the teams? Are you hiring high quality coaches for your men's teams and new cheap coaches for your women's teams? Are you providing equitable medical support, academic support? Are you promoting men's and women's sports the same? Are you providing comparable support to allow men's and women's sports alike to recruit? And so Title IX actually says you take all of this together and you can assess them at the molecular level, at the level of details. But then you get from those details a sense of a big picture. And if it turns out that every time there's a disparity or every time there's a disadvantage, that the tendency is that it's women's sports that are suffering from that disadvantage, then it's possible for courts or for the government to find that you're not in compliance with this aspect of Title IX either. So that's a little bit about what Title IX requires. Now let's talk a little bit about the impact that these requirements have had. So I want to talk about the impact that Title IX has had on participation at various levels. So when we're talking about high school sports, you can see that there's been an exponential growth in girls' high school athletic opportunities since Title IX's passage in 1972, right? From 300,000 to over 3.4 million high school athletic opportunities today. And this has to be attributed to Title IX's requirements. Sure, schools could comply with Title IX by just not having any sports at all, but they realize that they like sports, that sports are compatible with the educational mission of schools. They want to offer them, at least for boys, so Title IX means you have to also offer some comparable number of athletic opportunities, or at least expand your athletic opportunities for girls as well. So Title IX is contributing to this growth. But this only shows one side of the story. There's also, you take those same numbers and then show the growth of boys' sports over the same period of time. And so what Title IX has done is it has expanded the number of opportunities for women, surely, but it hasn't created equality. It hasn't closed the gap. The difference in number of athletic opportunities that boys have compared to girls today is over 1.1 million athletic opportunities more that boys enjoy over girls. So there has definitely been improvement, there's definitely been growth, but there is still a gap when it comes to looking at equality. And the same trend holds in college sports as well. You can see the red line here is showing the increase in number of opportunities for female athletes at the college level, which is terrific. Yet it's also true that opportunities for male athletes have grown at the same time. And so this slide is important. Similarly, it shows that Title IX hasn't created any kind of true, equity in the distribution of athletic opportunities. It also combats a narrative that Title IX takes something away from boys and men's sports. And clearly that has not been the case. Title IX has not caused the number of men or boys sports to diminish. In fact, it hasn't even caused schools and universities to hold the number of men's sports steady while women's sports catch up, which might have made sense, right, at one point from a compliance strategy. Some other things I want to say about participation trends is to just make more complex this narrative of the growth of opportunities in women's sports, because it hasn't affected all women the same. There has definitely been, the growth of women's sports has definitely benefited white women more than women of other races, as this slide demonstrates. That in terms of proportionality within women's sports, comparing the percentage of athletic opportunities that go to white women to the percentage of female students who are white, you can see that white female athletes are overrepresented among the female student population, whereas athletes of other races are underrepresented. So there hasn't been the same exact growth narrative affecting all races equally. Another participation or sort of numerical trend that I want to point out here in the Title IX era is, while athletic opportunities for female athletes has risen, the number of opportunities for female head coaches, and this data here is from the college level, has precipitously declined. Prior to Title IX, back when colleges and universities didn't take women's sports seriously, they didn't care who coached women's sports. They didn't pay them enough. They didn't care who the job wasn't prestigious. Only women were willing to do it, and so women were the head coaches of all the women's teams that existed prior to Title IX. Then Title IX kicks in, and colleges are forced to take women's sports more seriously, invest more resources. Now the job of being a head coach is more attractive, both to male and female aspiring coaches, and so men are competing with women for those positions and winning. And there's lots of reasons why that go into this trend that explain this trend. But one important one that I want to emphasize is the role of gender stereotypes in hiring. Women are still up against stereotypes that challenge their competency, their perceived leadership, their perceived ability to take sports seriously. They're still perceived to be more dramatic and bringing the drama to the team, and so those stereotypes, sometimes subconsciously, influence the decision makers to say, oh, well, it wasn't because of gender, it was because this person was a better fit, this person had more authority, this person had more skill, and it's gender stereotypes that are clouding the decision makers' perception of those things. Another reason why this decline in opportunities for female coaches has occurred has been that as women's sports has become a more, coaching women's sports has become a more serious job, it's become like the job of coaching men's sports, which is to say, not a very flexible job, not a very easy job to hold if you are also a member of the sex that society expects to do the majority of caretaking in families, right? So it can be harder for women to find role models, to find family support, to even find within themselves the vision to see themselves as somebody performing that role when it's so much in conflict with how women are raised to see themselves and how society expects women to perform these caretaking roles. So let me return to the question that I sort of raised at the beginning about Title IX and the credit that it deserves for the U.S. women's success in sport, whether it be Women's World Cup or our Olympic athletes that traditionally typically do quite well. I think that the answer is yes, in the sense that Title IX has created a legal nudge for schools to add more and provide more support for girls and women's athletics. And those additional opportunities are a direct pipeline into, elite athletic programs and our, training our future Olympians and things like that. The other thing that Title IX has done is help to shift cultural norms to make female athleticism more acceptable. It accomplishes the second by doing the first, right? By creating more, creating a legal mandate for gender equity in sports. It normalizes the idea that girls themselves can be athletes. That the law has said that's something we expect. That's something that we endorse as a legal principle. It starts to influence cultural norms. And then in addition, seeing more examples of female athleticism, because opportunities have been on the rise, also themselves start to change cultural norms in a direction that makes female athleticism more susceptible. But there are never easy answers. So if we're looking at this question, does Title IX deserve all the credit that it gets? Yes is part of the answer. Yes, by. But there's also this yes and piece that I want to emphasize, because it's not all just rosy here, right? Yes, Title IX deserves credit, but female athletes still get shortchanged in their athletic opportunities and resources. Many schools have compliance challenges. Most schools do not comply with that proportionality prong and are struggling to try to either attain that or compliance with that third option of addressing unmet interest. Many times when schools' programs are investigated, disparities in the quality of athletic opportunities are found. And the problem is probably even worse, hidden even more deeply from view at the high school level. So there are still a lot of compliance challenges, even though the law has these expectations and the law has promoted a lot of successful expansion of girls and women's athletic programs. There is still a lot of missing compliance that's out there. Also, as I pointed out, women of color have not experienced the same gains as white women. Female coaches are seriously outnumbered. Society hasn't equally embraced women's sports. People who do media studies, for example, do quantitative research on headlines and print space in newspapers that's devoted to men's versus women's sports. And, as one indicator of society's lack of full embrace for women's sports, those studies are always showing gross disparities in the attention given to female athletes. Women's sports are blamed for men's decline. As I mentioned before, that backlash narrative, that idea that Title IX has taken something away from men, even though it hasn't. There are barriers to entry, entering into athletic opportunities. Think about youth sports that have, pay-to-play structures. When it's expensive, when it's complicated to get your kids into sport in the first place, those kinds of barriers end up having a disproportionate impact on communities of color, and on communities that are located in areas where athletic space is at a premium, like urban areas, have a disproportionate impact on everyone who's of a lower socioeconomic status. So this progress narrative is, this is another dimension that's challenging that progress narrative. Homophobia and transphobia diminish opportunities in women's sports. It is still the case that female coaches feel pressure to hide their sexual orientation if they're gay, because the threat that opposing coaches could use it as a recruiting advantage to say, don't go play for that coach. She'll turn your kid gay, right? Come to my program where we run things like with a family atmosphere, right? I mean, that kind of concern prevails still to this day. And transgender girls and women are finding it increasingly difficult to exercise their right to play in girls and women's sports. Challenges, legal a law that was passed in Idaho, for example, this summer prohibits transgender girls from participating on girls' teams under any circumstance, even if they've transitioned in some way. Sexual harassment and sexual abuse also diminish opportunities for women in sport. If you're afraid to participate because of what might happen to you at the hands of your coach or another athlete who's in your program or connected to your program in some way, and if the mechanisms for redressing that sexual abuse or sexual harassment aren't strong, and you fear retaliation if you bring it up, and it's going to be the end of your career and nobody's going to take you seriously, that kind of atmosphere suppresses athletic interest, and in turn then suppresses athletic talent, because people will drop out rather than stick with the program to succeed. So, I want to leave you with the impression that Title IX has done a lot for women's sports, but I don't want to leave you with the impression that it's okay to be complacent, because these are all things that that still require support and advocacy. So the last thing I want to emphasize are some of the ways that that people who are on this call with me tonight can think about being advocates in their own right, not just for Title IX compliance, but for addressing some of these things that are beyond the scope of Title IX. But the first step is Title IX compliance. That's kind of the low-hanging fruit, because when you understand Title IX, if you educate yourself, you cultivate Title IX literacy, you can advocate easily in places where Title IX compliance isn't taking place. If you understand that something that your university is doing is out of compliance, you can use the threat of an enforcement action or a lawsuit to try to motivate compliance. I just saw just minutes ago, just right before this call, I saw a headline about something like that happening. It was a particular university that took advantage of the COVID moment, as many colleges and universities are, to sort of trim their athletic programs, either in response to COVID depleted budgets, or maybe they're just taking advantage of the pause in athletics to right-size their athletic programs, a decision they would have wanted to make anyway, and now they're just finding it's an easy time to do it. But this one university went too far and cut too many women's athletic opportunities. And when you cut opportunities, you negate any possibility of complying with that prong about unmet interest, because you've just created a whole team of people that are interested and able to participate, but now don't have a team. And you've also undermined any chance of showing that history and continuing practice of expanding opportunities for the underrepresented sex. So you boxed yourself into a corner. The only way you can comply with Title IX if you're cutting women's teams is to end up with proportionality, and this school didn't. Someone pointed it out to them, and they reinstated those women's teams. So that's what Title IX literacy can get you. It can get you an argument that is persuasive. On the athletic side, also on the sexual harassment and sexual misconduct side, people who have Title IX literacy know how to report, they know what to report, they know who to report it to. And that's something that college students should take on as an issue of advocacy for themselves and for each other. It's easy to do because colleges and universities, as part of their compliance obligation, are supposed to make it easy to find that information. And so if you start out on a quest for Title IX literacy to find out about sexual harassment and sexual misconduct reporting at your university and you can't find it, there's your first complaint, right? Because they should have made that information available to you. But then your activism can expand beyond this idea of compliance, because Title IX doesn't require schools to add more women coaches. Title IX doesn't require schools to care about racial diversity. Title IX doesn't require athletic programs to think about allyship to LGBTQ athletes and coaches. It doesn't require schools to think about the expense that the barriers to entry have and the deterrent effect that they might have on people of lower socioeconomic status. So we're going to need extra legal strategies to address those shortfalls and to really move from compliance with the law to actually fully realizing the vision of equality that exists in Title IX. How do you do that? You do that with a different kind of advocacy mentality. You have to think about the power that you have as a student. You choose which school you go to. Think about the power that you have as a fan. You choose which team you're going to buy tickets to support, whose games you're going to turn on the TV, whose merchandise you're going to wear, right? You get to make those choices, and there's some power in those choices. Maybe some of you listening are parents or are parents-to-be. You will have power in the choice of which athletic programs you're going to consider for your kids, how you're going to expose them to role models of coaches of different genders and races. You also have power in your friendship circles. Are you going to tolerate how women's sports is discussed, either the absence of any recognition or discussion? People are talking about March Madness. Are you going to insist that the discussion include recognition of the women's tournament, or are you going to let that default assumption of, NCAA basketball stand in as men's basketball? And you have power as members of a community. Maybe you're going to give of your time or your money to support programs that are important to you. In all of those contexts, you have the ability to choose the program that's doing it well, to receive your support, to receive your energy, to receive your endorsement. And you can choose to use that power to support programs that are doing it and doing it well. And you can also use your power of the purse, power of persuasion, to try to correct programs in your world that aren't quite that aren't quite doing it well. So if there's a sports program that has a diverse array of coaches, men's and women's, and you want your kid to have exposure to female coaches so that they're not the ones saying, we prefer male coaches and contributing to the demise of women coaches, choose to put your kid in that program. If there's not such a program, maybe it means you have to choose to become a coach so that those role models start to flourish. Right, so thinking about Title IX advocacy outside of just as a legal question and compliance, but looking at ways to influence in some of these other aspects as well. So that's the message I want to leave you with. I'm noticing that there are some questions, and I'll invite additional questions to show up as well. So I can Lana, do you want me to read Jane's question, or do you want to read it?
Sure. No, you can go ahead, and then I'll come back, and I have some questions myself.
Okay, great. Jane's question, help us understand how white women have more participation opportunities than women of color. How are opportunities rationed among women? Is the gap class-based as much and or more than a cultural group, or she follows up, or culturally biased? Yeah. So, I mean, I can offer some thoughts on this question. It's obviously a complex issue that's got a lot of dimensions. I think that one way we can look at it is that if colleges and universities are going to be thoughtful about racial equity within their women's athletic program, one place to start thinking of that is which sports programs are we going to add for women. So there was definitely there was a trend in the 90s when the NCAA was advancing certain women's sports and encouraging schools to add them. And when you step back and looked at them, you noticed, okay, so ice hockey, I mean, that's kind of a that's kind of, well, that's a white sport. I mean, it shouldn't be. But there are, barriers to entry in terms of access to ice rinks, culturally more linked to, northern cultures, Scandinavians and Canadians and things like that. So you've got advances in ice hockey. You've got rowing, which is like a prep school sport, not exactly economically and racial diverse in its origin. You've got You've got equestrian, golf, right? So these kinds of more like country club type sports. So if you're selecting sports that don't have a lot of racial diversity in them, you could be contributing to racial disparities within your women's sports program. The other thing to think about, though, is are there ways that we can make those sports, there's no reason why those sports shouldn't be more inclusive. It would be great if people of all races had opportunities to experience equestrian. So other things that, whether it be colleges and universities trying to use their influence on community programs, or community programs trying to come up with ways to diversify their athletic offerings. When school boards sit around and figure out that they need to attach a tax to parents who are going to put their kids in sports, understanding that that's going to have an impact on socioeconomic status, and in many places that's going to overlap with a racial disparity. So thinking about it in terms of the opportunities that are being provided, as well as what kind of gateway and pipelines are coming into sports. There are other dimensions to that question as well. I think that's, I'll leave it at that as sort of a bit of a taste of an answer there. But I think it's a very important question that we should be paying attention to at all levels of sport.
Thank you, Erin. And if anyone has any additional questions, please feel free to type them into the Q&A box, and we will get to those in a moment. I just really want to thank you. You've given me a lot to think about, and I'm not an athlete, but very competitive natured, so I'm fired up and ready to advocate. Equity is such an important topic, especially on our campus right now, and I really appreciate you've addressed one of the goals that I wanted to accomplish with this program, and that is making our audiences, our students, our faculty, and our staff more aware of Title IX beyond the sexual assault side of things, but also that compliance takes work. We have a role to play, but there are so many things that happen behind the scenes at the university to be able, for those of us who are just fans, to go sit in the stands or sit in the stadiums, that there is a lot of work to be done. And I certainly learned a lot about compliance. So in looking at the demographic of the University of South Carolina's coaches, we have a fair number of female coaches, and I'm just wondering your thoughts. How do our numbers compare to other large public universities as far as female-male ratio coaches? Do you know?
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess the numbers that I have more sort of at the ready, off the top of my head, are the kinds of numbers that show how women are minorities of head coaches even among women's teams as a whole. And there are certain sports where that disparity is even more pronounced. A lot of them are sports where you would expect, because both men and women play the sport, and so you have the ability for someone who grew up, a man who grew up with a soccer background, to be able to say, sure, I'm qualified to coach women playing soccer because soccer is my sport. But sometimes the sports where this disparity is strong are surprising, and softball is one, because softball is not a sport that at least collegiate male athletes grow up playing. They play baseball instead, and despite some rumors to the contrary, they're not the same sport. They're different sports. They have different strategies, some different skills. And so the idea that a man could waltz in and claim credibility for coaching a sport that he himself did not play, think about how hard it would be for a woman to try to break into a sport that they themselves didn't play. There have been some high-profile examples of baseball and football teams that have put a female coach on their coaching staff, and that's wonderful. But at this point, those are still exceptions that define the rule. So I think the best I can do is sort of offer some context and some connection to that trend. And there may be some sports where USC's coaching staff is consistent with that trend in other sports where maybe they're on the other side.
Thank you. So you talked about mentorship and role models, and I was just wondering, can you share your thoughts on the NCAA rule that says that coaches can't be photographed with like young people in elementary school? I'm thinking of Dawn Staley being particularly disappointed and upset with the rule because she was advocating, how can I be a role model if this is not acceptable? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I can see why in general some might think that a rule like that is a good idea, that you want to keep some distance between coaches and future potential athletes so that there's not a high pressure sort of recruiting atmosphere, which we know is part of what's problematic about college sports. The pressure that college sports put on young athletes to devote their lives to sport, notwithstanding the fact that there are far, far fewer collegiate athletic opportunities than there are high school athletic opportunities. So you're creating a lot of disappointed people when you put that kind of pressure on youth sports, and you make every parent think that their way to send their kid to college is through a scholarship that requires just completely turning your life over to youth and sports. And if those sports are expensive, that explains why there's a socioeconomic status and racial disparity in those sports. All those problems are sort of connected to why the NCAA would want to have some barriers around coaches' contact with young athletes to reduce some of that recruiting-like pressure. But I sure do see, Dawn Staley's point that like you want to give college or young athletes that kind of access so that they can say, I see myself like that person, and maybe I'm aspiring to be an athlete, but further down the line I'm aspiring actually to this career as a coach, and those kinds of moments can be really powerful in those lines. I would just hope that they can find ways to live within the rule and still accomplish those goals. You can't be photographed, but that doesn't mean you can't be with them. That doesn't mean you can't have moments. And that doesn't mean that other athletes can't stand in those sort of photograph moments. So, hopefully there's some balance there. But I see, I agree. I share that concern that there's some we want to foster role modeling and not suppress it.
If you'll indulge me, I have one last question. Mm-hmm. And I don't know that you can answer it.
Uh-oh.
No, I mean, it shows my own ignorance. Can the appointment of a new Supreme Court justice impact Title IX in the future, or in the future? I mean, as far as universities and.
Well, so a Supreme Court justice wouldn't necessarily change what the law says, or with the regulations that are, doing a lot of the detail work about Title IX. That said, there have been Supreme Court cases that have addressed things that Title IX is not clear about. There are, Supreme Court cases that made it clear that if you are the victim of sex discrimination, you can sue for money damages, for example. And the Supreme Court litigation that gave rise to the standard that allows victims of sexual misconduct to sue the institution in certain cases, and that's been transformative. That's why Title IX has become so impactful in the context of sexual misconduct. So the Supreme Court has, in moments, played a role of influence. There's not an obvious. Well, here's, so this summer, the Supreme Court decided a Title VII case that said the sex discrimination provisions in our employment discrimination statute cover discrimination against LGBTQ people. Does that automatically extend to other civil rights laws that have sex discrimination provisions? And that would include Title VII. Many people argue that in general it does, but there's still needs to be some litigation to sort out what that actually means in the context of sex segregated programs and facilities. So does it mean that transgender students can play girls sports? Does it mean that transgender girls can use the girls bathroom? Those are going to be questions litigated, and anything litigated could make its way to the Supreme Court, especially when courts disagree and when there's like a differing approach in different jurisdictions. The Supreme Court's sense of wanting to impose harmony might kick in, and they could take a case like that down the road. I think in the more near term, the bigger impacts on Title IX are going to be who gets elected, in a couple weeks, both in terms of the presidency and in terms of Congress, because both have the power to undo a lot of the steps that the current administration has taken to change the way that schools respond to sexual misconduct, making it harder for victims to get vindication and easier for respondents to, through procedural rights, some would argue, avoid accountability for sexual misconduct. A new Department of Education, if they're under a new presidential administration, could make a few immediate changes, could also put in get the ball rolling for some longer term regulatory changes. And on top of that, a newly configured Congress could preempt the whole regulatory mess and could change things in the law that would clarify Title IX's application in that area. Not to mention changes to a new Department of Education would just create a stronger incentive for enforcement that might motivate schools to do a better job compliance with their athletic equity pieces as well. There's a lot on the horizon for Title IX. It's an exciting moment to be paying attention to this particular political issue, because I think a lot could change.
Well, thank you so much. And we're about at time. I don't see any additional questions, so I really want to thank you again for your time with us this evening. This has been so exciting, and your enthusiasm. I hope that some of our listeners or participants are thinking, yes, I want to advocate, or maybe they want to take the deep dive and go to law school.
It's weird that I don't see any of you, but feel free to reach out. If you learned something, let me know. If you have a question that you didn't get to answer or that you think of later, I'd be happy to hear from anyone in this audience.
Well, you've been so generous, and you set me up for the segue. In talking about sexual assault in Title IX and civil rights, tomorrow afternoon, the Victims' Rights Advocacy Department over at the Student Health Center, they're hosting an event for us and with us called I Spy, and it's for University of South Carolina students only, and you will have to pre-register, and you can do so by looking at the McKissick Museum website. But this is an opportunity for them to explain to you some of the minor aggressions that happen, stalking, gaslighting, and being able to recognize those in the media so that you can better prepare yourself in case you're in that type of situation. So again, thank you all. Thank you so much, Erin. Thank you. And thank you to our audience, and thank you to the College of Arts and Sciences for the funding for the Justice Theme semester. And we hope that you'll stay tuned and visit us at McKissick Museum online and through our Facebook Live programs. And we look forward to seeing you in the future and hope you have a great night. Thanks again.